Welcome to the William Howard and Hazel Butler Peters Lecture, hosted by the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies. My name is Jay Buckley. I'm the director of the center. Hazel Butler was born in 1912 in Douglas, Arizona, the fifth child of John Topham and Susan Elizabeth Redd Butler. She graduated from Arizona State Teacher College, now Arizona State University, in 1934, and taught school in Mesa, Arizona for 11 years. She met William Howard Peters in Phoenix, Arizona in 1941. He recently graduated in business administration from Stanford, but after the Pearl Harbor attack that year, he volunteered for military service in World War II. After that, he was in officers training school and served in the Air Force from 1942 to 1945. When he returned, he and Hazel married in Pasadena, California, before moving to Glendale. Hazel and Howard had various civic engagements in Glendale, and upon their deaths in 1981 and 1995, contributed to the Redd legacy by donating to the Redd Center. So this lecture is named in their honor. We're grateful for them and their families. Now we'll turn the time over to Dr. Brenda Renzi to introduce her. Who's also from Arizona.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. We are working to get this microphone working. Apologies for that. Our speaker today, Maurice Crandall, is a citizen of the Yavapai Apache Nation of Camp Verde, Arizona. He is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Native American and Indigenous Studies at Dartmouth College. Professor Crandall is a historian of indigenous peoples of the U.S.-Mexico borderlands, primarily in New Mexico, Arizona, and Sonora. He holds a bachelor's degree in history from here at Brigham Young University, and then earned an MA and PhD, both in history, from the University of New Mexico. After his time at UNM, he was a fellow at the Clements Center for the Study of Southwestern America, and also worked at the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center in Albuquerque, New Mexico. His first book, from which he'll be pulling content today, is entitled, "These People Have Always Been a Republic, Indigenous Electorates in the U.S.-Mexico Borderlands, 1598 to 1912. It was published by the University of North Carolina Press in the David J. Weber series in the New Borderlands History in 2019. These People Have Always Been a Republic has won multiple awards, including the 2020 Coffee Western History Prize for the most distinguished book on the history of the American West from the Western History Association, the 2020 Weber Clements Prize for the best nonfiction book on the Southwestern America, also from the Western History Association, a Southwest Book Award from the Border Regional Library Association, and an honorable mention for the 2020 Hermione Wheeler-Vogelin Book Award from the American Society for Ethnic History. Professor Crandall's current book project explores the crucial role played by Yavapai and Dilsey Apache scouts in building and strengthening their communities after the so-called Indian Wars. Dr. Crandall's a good friend. You'll be hard-pressed to find a nicer guy, and we're very excited to have him back here at BYU. So join me in welcoming Professor Crandall.
Nice to be here. If I start sweating profusely, it's because this light is really bright. Feeling the heat, I feel like a chicken nugget at Maverick or something. So last night when I got into my hotel, the clerk at the desk said, "Oh, what, are you here for work?" And it's a typical conversation. I said, "Yeah, I'm giving a talk tomorrow at BYU." And he said, "Oh, what's your talk on?" And I said, "Well, I'm a historian, so it's history." "Well, what kind of history?" And I said, "It's Native American history." And he said, "Oh," and then went on to his work. So I suppose that wasn't the most interesting thing to him, but I hope that your feelings are a little bit different after listening to this. I'm grateful to be here, grateful to Dr. Renzi, Dr. Buckley, and Amy Carlin for putting this event on and handling all of these logistics, the invitation, I haven't been to Utah in almost 20 years. It's been quite a while, and things, landscape and strip mall central now, it seems like, more than before. Changed quite a bit, but it's nice to be here and see the mountains so close. It's cool to see the landscape again. So today my talk is, like Brendan said, loosely based around my book, although it'll cover some different ground as well. But I want to address some contemporary history of Native American enfranchisement and voting, and then also sort of turn the clock back to material that I researched and wrote about. So it's sort of backwards. I'm working from contemporary to the past, but I hope that it makes sense as I go forward. So I want to start with this slide, which has some individuals that many of you might recognize. In many ways, the 2018 U.S. midterm elections, which now almost seem like a lifetime ago, represented important milestones for Native American voters and politicians. Deb Holland of Laguna Pueblo was elected from New Mexico's 1st Congressional District, and Sharice Davids, who is Ho-Chunk, was victorious in Kansas' 3rd Congressional District. And the pair together became the first Native American women elected to Congress in the United States. For both of them, their status as indigenous peoples and historical struggles by Native Americans to vote in the United States were strong motivators, and they said as much. Holland, for example, became particularly active in the 2004 John Kerry presidential campaign, and she got her hands on lists of Native American voters around the country and would cold call them, invite them to vote, to turn out at the polls. During the 2008 Obama campaign, Holland also took carloads of people and canvassed in Native American communities on a daily basis. Her main motivation in that work was to get the vote out in underrepresented communities, which in this case was Native American communities. Sharice Davids also represents a number of firsts for Kansas. She was the first person in her family to attend college. She was also a professional mixed martial artist for a time, which I think is pretty awesome. She's the first Native American woman elected to Congress from Kansas, and the second Native American elected to Congress from Kansas. The first was Charles Curtis, who was a Republican, had a long career in Congress, and was Hoover's vice president. But Davids is also Kansas's first openly gay person elected to Congress, and of course, as many of you would know, Deb Holland's recent confirmation as the Interior Secretary. We now have the first Native person in a cabinet position in the United States. So these accomplishments are significant. They're huge. Thinking about their 2018 elections in particular, these were milestones in Native American voting and political participation. Many people saw them as a hurdle surpassed by Native American people and voters. As one journalist with the National Geographic reported at that time, quote, "The wins for Holland and Davids highlight the long road to full participation and representation for Native Americans in politics," close quote. I don't need to tell you how important the 2020 election cycle was as well, but it was particularly important for Native Americans, given the fact that barriers to Native American voting remained strong nationally, and even some international news outlets took note of the prospect of Native American voting and how it could affect the outcome of the 2020 election. Time magazine ran an article in October of 2020 titled Native Americans could help swing Arizona, but many struggle to cast their ballot. And that article highlighted how the Native American vote in Arizona, while comparatively small, was poised to make a big impact in a crucial swing state. One Navajo activist, Tara Benally, spearheaded an effort to register rural reservation voters who faced a number of difficulties in voting. For example, many don't have formal street addresses and don't receive mail at their homes, making it difficult to register to vote. Others don't know what precinct they live in and are hours away from polling stations and post offices. So Benally and her team registered thousands of voters in the run-up to this election in 2020. And this is the kind of work that Secretary Holland engaged in for a number of years, and it's sorely needed work even today. And it paid off for Democratic voters. As many of you know, the Native American vote was pivotal in swinging Arizona blue in November of 2020. So it's correct to say that Native Americans have been systematically barred from voting for a long, long time, particularly in New Mexico and Arizona, the two states that make up the bulk of my research on Native American enfranchisement. These were among the last states to allow Native people to vote. When New Mexico and Arizona were both admitted to the United States in 1912, each had state constitutions that barred Native people from voting, and the states actively pursued that policy. They continued to exclude Native peoples even after Congress passed the Indian Citizenship Act in 1924, which ostensibly allowed all Native people to vote and made them citizens of the United States. For example, in 1928, 4 years after the Indian Citizenship Act, Peter Porter and Rudolph Johnson, who were both from the Gila River Indian community in Arizona, attempted to register to vote. And when they made their way to the county registrar's office to register to vote, they were turned away and the registration was refused. So the question then is, how could Native people be denied a right expressly guaranteed under an act of Congress? And I would say, to put it simply, as settler states often do, the United States found a way to get around its own statutes at the expense of people of color, indigenous people in this case. While the Indian Citizenship Act granted birthright citizenship to Native peoples in the U.S., importantly, it left the qualifications for voting up to each state individually. So the state of Arizona refused to allow Peter Porter and Rudolph Johnson to vote, even though they were citizens by an act of Congress, and it used the wording of Article 7, Section 2 of the Arizona State Constitution. And that article read, quote, "No person under guardianship, non-compos mentis or insane, shall be qualified to vote at any election," close quote. In other words, the state of Arizona classed Indians in the same category as wards of the state and the mentally insane. Arizona's reasoning, though, was well-trod territory, dated all the way back to the U.S. Supreme Court's Cherokee Nation v. Georgia case in 1831, in which Chief Justice John Marshall's majority opinion stated that, quote, "Their," meaning the Cherokees in this case, and then by extension all Native peoples, "relation to the United States resembles that of a ward to his guardian," close quote. So as Arizona reasoned, if Indians were wards of the federal government, which they must be since their affairs were overseen by a federal agency in the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and long upheld Supreme Court decisions classed them as wards, then it was perfectly acceptable to deny them the franchise, Indian Citizenship Act notwithstanding. Porter and Johnson took the county registrar to court, and in a case decided in 1928, Porter v. Hall, the Arizona Supreme Court upheld the legality of the state's denial of Indian voting rights, and thereby made Native people in Arizona non-voting citizens. So exactly 20 years later, after the Porter decision, it was again challenged. In 1948, World War II Marine Corps veteran and Fort McDowell Yavapai, Frank Harrison, along with his friend and then tribal chair Harry Austin, attempted to register to vote, this time in Maricopa County. And this is a photo of Frank Harrison later in his life. They were motivated by a sense of rage at the unjust conditions of their people. Frank Harrison was a World War II veteran. He had been in the Marine Corps, and he was determined to exercise what he viewed as his rights as an American citizen, and wanted to help lift up his community as well. The registrar, who was a guy by the name of Roger Levine, refused to register them and gave the familiar refrain from 20 years earlier, quote, "You're under the wardship of the government," close quote. So Harrison sued Levine, this time with the support of the new National Congress of American Indians, the American Civil Liberties Union as well, and others wrote amicus briefs on his behalf. And Harrison and Harry Austin initially lost in Maricopa County Superior Court, but they persisted. And Harrison v. Levine, which was handed down on July 15th, 1948 by the Arizona Supreme Court, ruled that the court 20 years previous had erred in denying Peter Porter and Rudolph Johnson their right to vote. Arizona could no longer deny Native people the right to vote under the concept of guardianship. This paved the way for Native American voting and full citizenship in Arizona, which is where I'm from. Although there have certainly been and continue to be difficulties with Native people voting in Arizona. It's always problematic. Similarly, a Isleta Pueblo citizen by the name of Miguel Trujillo, who's pictured here with his daughter, had served in the Marine Corps during World War II. He attended the University of New Mexico, where he earned both a BA and MA, And he went on to work for the Bureau of Indian Affairs as a school teacher at Laguna Pueblo, which is where Deb Holland is from. And in 1948, like Frank Harrison and Harry Austin in Arizona, he attempted to register to vote in Valencia County. And the Valencia County recorder, Eloy Garley, refused to allow Trujillo to register to vote. But in this case, Article 7, Section 1 of the New Mexico Constitution is a little different than Arizona's. It read, "Every male citizen of the United States who is over the age of 21 years and has resided in New Mexico 12 months, in the county 90 days, and in the precinct in which he offers to vote 30 days, next preceding the election, except idiots, insane persons, persons convicted of a felonious or infamous crime, unless restored political rights, and Indians not taxed, shall be qualified to vote in all elections for public offices." So, although New Mexico also grouped Indians with, quote, idiots, insane persons, and persons convicted of a felonious or infamous crime, close quote, like similar to Arizona, it denied the right to vote on the grounds that Indians were not taxed. So what does this mean? The idea of Indians not taxed has a deep constitutional root and precedent. Article 1, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution referred to congressional representation and direct taxes, stating that state representation in the House would be based on the, quote, whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, close quote. Incidentally, slaves counted as 3/5 of a person under the Constitution at that time, while Native Americans didn't count at all. But again, what's meant by Indians not taxed, especially in 1948? The idea persisted and still persists to this day that Native peoples don't pay taxes. And that's simply not true at all. But again, I encounter people all the time that say, oh, you don't pay taxes and you get everything free. Newsflash, that is not true. In 1948 and today, Native peoples pay nearly all the same taxes that other people pay. In New Mexico, where Miguel Trujillo was attempting to register to vote. What they didn't pay was a property tax on reservation lands, which the lands are held in trust by the federal government. So you can't pay a property tax on that land because it's not actually owned by Native people. Trujillo, like Harrison, sued the county registrar, and Felix Cohen, who was an attorney and the so-called father of federal Indian law, served as Trujillo's attorney. And on August 3rd, 1948, mere weeks after the Arizona Supreme Court had handed down the Harrison decision, the federal court in Santa Fe ruled in Trujillo v. Garley that Native Americans in New Mexico could no longer be kept from voting. Thus, within a fateful 2-week period in 1948, 2 court cases, one decided at the federal district court in Santa Fe and the other at the Arizona Supreme Court. Native peoples in those 2 neighboring states, Arizona and New Mexico, were finally fully enfranchised. As a personal aside, my own interest in this topic comes from my grandfather. This is a photo of him. He's on the swing in the background. That's my uncle in front. My grandfather was twice arrested as a juvenile in the 1920s and 30s in Arizona. This photo comes from when he was at Indian boarding school. Many of you are probably familiar with that history, where Native children were taken and subjected to cultural genocide, attempt to kill Native languages, traditions, and lifeways. But my grandfather was sort of like to raise Cain, was arrested 2 times, and he served first a summer at the Arizona Boys Ranch, as it was called, and then a year as a white ranching family's, essentially their indentured servant. And in both cases, he had no trial. He was simply arrested, deemed guilty of a crime, and sent off to serve his time. So I'm interested in how Native peoples don't have rights that should be guaranteed under federal acts. So returning to Deb Holland and Sharice Davids and then these recent elections, this is a history that I think is significant, is worth remembering. In the lead up to the election in 2020, I saw efforts daily on my Facebook feed. It was blown up all the time about mobilizing Native American votes, efforts to quote unquote rock the vote, chose for the title of this talk. Often these initiatives are framed as the natural evolution of past efforts by individuals like Frank Harrison and Miguel Trujillo, And we, as their Native American descendants, need to do our part. I've seen voting referred to as a sacred act. As you see here, Deb Holland is wearing a shirt that said voting is sacred. And I've heard it articulated in this way as well. Clinton Patia, who was the longtime tribal president of the Fort McDowell Yavapai Nation, from which Frank Harrison came, and passed away a few years ago, he stated, "If Indian citizens cannot participate in the state electoral processes, if they cannot vote, then the principles of democracy are seriously weakened. If Indian citizens cannot or will not vote, then the achievements of Harry Austin and Frank Harrison can be lost and their sacrifices made meaningless." So a lot of the historiography and literature of Native American voting in the United States is framed in this way, as sort of a long struggle culminating in the mid to late 20th century, acts by Congress, favorable court decisions. For example, one work depicted the struggle for indigenous enfranchisement in New Mexico specifically as a fight, culminating in mid-20th century legal decisions after much struggle by Native peoples to obtain the vote. And this type of scholarship speaks to a human desire for progressive triumphalist narratives, where Indian citizenship and voting are long struggles with identifiable, definite conclusions, celebrating individuals like Frank Harrison, Miguel Trujillo, people in the larger civil rights movements like Rosa Parks and others. Furthermore, by not exercising our right as Native Americans to vote, we're defiling the memory of people who long struggled in this way. And we're disrespecting their sacrifices, rejecting their hard-won victories. This is how it's often framed. I agree that it's important to celebrate path-breaking individuals, but these types of narratives that have a sort of tidy, definite ending don't really bear out in New Mexico, Arizona, Sonora, the places that I research and write about, which are borderland settings where power is contested and not always clear. And what I found in my research is that the indigenous peoples of the US-Mexico borderlands were, in fact, enfranchised peoples throughout the Spanish, Mexican, and US periods. What's more, they rejected the right to vote on a number of occasions, and often by rejecting the right to vote, they were able to secure their own existence as indigenous nations, as autonomous indigenous communities. And that's what my book really looks at. It examines this long evolution of indigenous voting rights and how Native communities in this borderlands region absorbed, adapted, and most importantly for today's discussion perhaps, rejected also colonially imposed forms of electoral politics from the late 16th century all the way through the 20th century. And I try to illustrate how indigenous communities both embraced but also refused the franchise, always as a way to strengthen their own sovereignty and autonomy. So the previously mentioned Felix Cohen wrote in his landmark 1941 Handbook of Federal Indian Law, drink here, quote, "In a democracy, suffrage is the most basic civil right, since its existence is the chief means whereby other rights may be safeguarded," close quote. And that conclusion seems relatively sound. The vote is essential because armed with the franchise, groups can then see to it that their other rights are protected. So for many people, it seems counterintuitive to view a refusal to vote or engage in electoral politics as a valid political statement. I mean, how many times have you heard the phrase, if you don't vote, then you have nothing to complain about. You don't have any argument against how politics develop. The fact that voter registration initiatives among Native peoples that I've seen frequently shame those who don't vote in local, state, and national elections is telling. A refusal to vote would be sacrilege, right, if voting is sacred. But when we're thinking about the history of Native American voting in the region of the US-Mexico borderlands, we need to stop thinking about voting and enfranchisement solely in terms of rights. It's not just about rights. Instead, we need to focus on sovereignty, because to Native people, sovereignty is always more important than rights. It wasn't until fairly recently that discussions of voting in the American Southwest even used the language of rights and citizenship. In fact, Up until around the middle of the 20th century, many indigenous communities, as I've seen in my research, actively avoided U.S. citizenship. They avoided enfranchisement. This was certainly the case for the 4 groups that I write about. And in the time left, I want to use some examples to illustrate this point, and thinking about enfranchisement in different ways, and also refusal to engage in political politics. So, I want to turn our minds back to the time of Spanish colonial control over this region, which included a vast swath of the American Southwest. And for many indigenous people in this region, everyday life was significantly affected by the Spanish Crown and the Catholic Church, the 2 arms of Spanish colonialism. For most indigenous communities under Spanish control, this meant that there was a Catholic mission there in the community, and most of the everyday interactions with the colonial machine were filtered through a missionary, who would be typically a Franciscan or a Jesuit, depending on the location and the time period we're talking about. And Spain, for its part, was never happy to deal with large councils of traditional leaders in indigenous communities, which is how most indigenous communities are governed historically. The idea of a chief holding some kind of supreme executive power is not a historical reality for the most part. It was through council, through a group of elders and people talking and communicating and discussing the affairs of the community that decisions were made. But Spain didn't want to deal with this kind of thing. They were never happy to deal with large councils of traditional leaders where leadership was shared in different groups, such as priestly societies or clans. They wanted a single individual to identify and with whom they could conduct diplomatic and community relations. So to counter that type of traditional leadership and knowledge sharing among various groups and streamline colonial administration, what Spain did was, through law, it mandated that each indigenous community have a core of elected officials with a gobernador, or a governor, at the top, and then a handful of other officers below that town governor who was indigenous. So imagine that we're at one of these communities in the 17th or 18th century. It may look like this one here, which is Oquehuingue Pueblo in northern New Mexico, but it may look different. It's nearing the end of the year, late December, and the community members are called to a community house, either by town criers on the rooftops calling the people to a meeting, or clanging of bells, blowing of horns, all of this signaling that a town election is to take place. And in that indigenous community, members gather at the community house and select their leaders, typically for terms lasting 1 year. At the community house, the town electorate, which may include all adult males, but it may also include women, or be restricted to men of high status, they conduct these elections. Their newly elected leaders are approved by the mission priest, who gives them sanction from the church, and then those elected leaders would travel to the provincial capital to receive confirmation in their offices by the highest officer of the Spanish crown, typically a provincial governor. In the case of New Mexico, this would be traveling to Santa Fe, while in Sonora, this meant a trip to Piti, which later became known as Hermosillo. Then on January 6th, the Epiphany, or Three Kings Day, a mass was celebrated for the new officials, and they're officially the governing officers for their communities for the rest of that year, until that election is repeated again at the end of the year. And these officers, often in combination with traditional community religious leaders or town elites, formed a governing council known as a cabildo or ayuntamiento. And at Oquehuingue Pueblo, this is what the structure of the elected officers looked like. Now, an important thing to note about this electoral process is that Spain largely left it to each indigenous community to determine the finer points of town elections. In the pueblos of New Mexico, for example, traditional religious leaders often chose the governor, the lieutenant governor, and the other officers, which is what's sort of charted out here. And those who would serve for the year, and then those decisions were sort of confirmed by councils of leaders of various religious societies, but it wasn't electoral as much as it was selectoral. But at the Yaqui communities in Sonora, you had a process that more resembled what we might think of as an election, with a handful of men standing for office and then one chosen from among them. At the Tohono O'odham missions of far northern Sonora, in what's today southern Arizona and northern Mexico. Jesuit priests often controlled the elections, choosing men that they believed would be more malleable to the desires of church and crown. But in all these cases, these leaders and the processes that put them in power were officially sanctioned. Governors received silver-tipped canes from the King of Spain, known as varas de justicia, and they were symbols of their authority. Here you have a photo from the 19th century depicting two Pueblo town governors in New Mexico holding those canes. Thus, from the earliest years of Spanish colonial control in the Southwest, indigenous communities had direct experience with some form of electoral processes at the town level. And they were highly invested in these processes, frequently filing official petitions and complaints to Spanish officials when non-indigenous individuals interfered in these elections. Some went so far as to travel all the way to Mexico City, which was the viceregal capital, to air their electoral complaints. We found cases of Yaqui leaders who traveled to Mexico City in 1740 after Jesuits deposed them as governors. And I would even contend that indigenous peoples were just as enfranchised, if not more so, than non-indigenous Spaniards during the Spanish colonial period. And the reason that I say that is, while they didn't vote for provincial officers or governors, Spanish officials, neither did Spaniards. Outside of the town level until the very end of the Spanish period and the reforms of the Cadiz constitutions, there were no popularly elected provincial officials in New Spain. The viceroy wasn't elected, neither were the vast majority of other offices. So in many ways, indigenous communities under Spanish colonial control were actually enfranchised. They were legally entitled to elect their own officers. The officers did important work such as punishing community offenders, taking Spaniards to court for violations of protected indigenous lands, filing petitions to colonial courts and seats of power, and a host of other activities. But at the same time, I want to be clear, in no way am I saying that this was a good or benign system. It was full of abuses and violence. Often it broke down, and it was fundamentally a colonial imposition on these indigenous communities. And they would have much rather just kept their own institutions as they already existed. But indigenous communities made do and did the best that they could under these circumstances, and they incorporated this electoral model. They adapted it to community needs, always with the goal of protecting community sovereignty and autonomy. So moving forward, if we transition from the Spanish period and look at the Mexican period, which in the US Southwest is essentially from 1821 to 1846, many indigenous peoples were even more enfranchised than before, as Mexican law declared all Mexican citizens, regardless of whether they're indigenous or not, citizens. Mexican law included mixed municipal councils composed of indigenous and non-indigenous members, as well as elections for representatives to national legislative bodies, although these weren't so much popular elections as they were indirect elections where they chose electors who then chose representatives. And there were some indigenous electors in these indirect elections. In an example of what I would term revolutionary enfranchisement, Pueblo Indians in New Mexico and Nuevo Mexicanos, so ethnic non-Pueblo Indians, but sometimes with indigenous ancestry, sometimes not, they joined forces in 1837 and deposed the governor, Albino Perez, and actually executed him, and elected in his place a man by the name of Jose Gonzalez, who was an illiterate bison hunter of mixed Taos Pueblo and Nuevo Mexicano ancestry, but he was indigenous. And this Rio Arriba Rebellion, as it's come to be called, has other names as well. It was ultimately pushed down, and Jose Gonzalez was executed, but for a brief moment, New Mexico had an indigenous governor, which can't be said of anywhere really, not in the United States certainly, and also a multi-ethnic coalition governing the province. They had their own representative governing body at Santa Fe. But Mexico's relationship with indigenous peoples was imperfect at best. It was full of violence, but it was trending more democratic and inclusive than the United States at that time. That can be said without any doubt. In other words, what I'm getting at is it's a historical fallacy to think that Mexico and Spain were undemocratic and that indigenous peoples had no experience with voting and enfranchisement before the 20th century. That's just not true in this region. When the U.S. took over a huge swath of Mexican territory during and after the U.S.-Mexico War in the 1840s, it was not the bearer of democracy to peoples with no experience with voting and elections. So with this in mind, what happens in the Southwest during the Territorial Period, which is the second half of the 19th and the first decade of the 20th, is clearer. It becomes more, we can understand it with better clarity. And I'm primarily referring here to New Mexico and Arizona. Take, for example, Tohono O'odham peoples who inhabit that region right at the U.S.-Mexico border. They've been missionized and colonized since the second half of the 17th century. The large mission at San Javier del Bac is a testament to this missionizing project. This is that mission there. They've been subjected to the Spanish system of Indian town government with annual elections, as well as the often frenetic mandates of the Mexican era. So when the United States arrived in their territory, which came in the 1850s after the Gadsden Purchase, Tohono O'odhams were already well-versed in systems of colonial administration. The United States believed it had found people ripe for citizenship and enfranchisement and incorporation, but these people had already been involved in a regional economy for decades, working in mines and on ranches, for example. Simply put, these people, Tohono O'odhams, were not communities with no previous contact with outsiders. They were not eager to adopt a U.S. system of labor and land tenure. But the United States believed itself the bearer of the correct way, and it attempted to mold Tohono O'odhams in the Anglo-American model. The most powerful method undertaken by the U.S. government was to allot Tohono O'odham lands under the Dawes Act. When allotment was completed in 1890 for Tohono O'odhams, 42,000 acres of the San Javier del Bac reservation were allotted to individual plots, heads of household and others. But the U.S. failed to understand that this land is not made for that type of 40-acre and a mule system that it had envisioned. Tohono O'odhams had mastered this landscape, which you sort of see here. It's a very harsh desert landscape. And they've mastered it through a combination of agriculture, gathering of foodstuffs seasonally, hunting, migration. And many of them simply ignored the property markers installed by allotment officials. But for the U.S., they needed to become farmers in sort of the Jeffersonian vision, each person having his own individual plot. And more importantly for my talk today, allotted Tohono O'odhams were entitled to U.S. citizenship and voting under the terms of the Dawes Act. So John Berger, who was a Swiss-born naturalized U.S. citizen, worked as an Indian Bureau employee at San Javier del Bac Reservation for more than 25 years during the 19th and early 20th centuries. And you can read his reports where year after year he's writing to his superiors that Tohono O'odhams were on the cusp of becoming civilized, of becoming like mainstream Americans, even exercising the right to vote. For example, in 1899, though, nearly 10 years after allotment had begun at San Javier, he was quite disappointed. He wrote, quote, "Not a single allottee has exercised his right to suffrage," close quote. His tenure ended in 1910 when he died, and in none of his reports did he indicate that Tohono O'odhams had shown any interest in becoming U.S. citizens and voting in elections. And the simple fact of the matter is that they wanted to select their own leadership in ways of their choosing, and they didn't exercise the right to suffrage because they didn't want to. Citizenship in their own communities and their own indigenous nations was more important than U.S. citizenship and political incorporation, and the allure of gaining supposed rights didn't convince them otherwise. Much the same can be said of Hopis in northern Arizona during this period of U.S. territorial control there. From the late 1840s to 1912 in statehood. U.S. Indian agents and trading post operators, missionaries, and others who lived and worked at the Hopi mesas often characterized Hopis as peaceful, agreeable, ripe for citizenship and voting. Many aren't aware also that Hopi was allotted, that there was an allotment scheme at Hopi. And allotment was pursued between 1891 and 1894, and then again in 1910, but those efforts failed. Not only that, education and the civilizing project at Hopi was characterized by violence and community disruption. American schooling in particular, which would have turned young Hopis into citizens and enfranchised voters, was opposed by many. Hopi leaders from the village of O'Reilly, for example, resisted the kidnapping and shipping off of their children to boarding schools. These leaders were arrested, sent to Alcatraz Island as prisoners in 1894 and 95. This is a photo from Alcatraz where Hopis were imprisoned for a time. So while American officials were optimistic that Hopis would become voting citizens through their efforts, I found absolutely no records of Hopi voting during the Progressive Era and Territorial Period. Instead, Hopis maintained their ancient forms of governance, their traditional life ways throughout this period. Furthermore, in their struggle with the invasive forces of assimilation that converged on their homeland, they also retained a portion of their traditional territory intact during this time. And like Tohono O'odhams, they did so as citizens of their own sovereign communities, not as citizens of the United States. The final example I want to share for this part is that of the Pueblo nations of New Mexico. And I conclude with them because perhaps they offer the most illustrative and also the most clearly articulated argument about citizenship and enfranchisement during this period. When Stephen Watts Kearny's Army of the West invaded and took over New Mexico in 1846, as is depicted here, and raised the flag over the Palace of the Governors, Pueblo Indian nations in New Mexico had been electing their officers and governing their communities in using colonial models for the better part of 250 years. That's longer than the constitutional government of the United States has been in place here in the United States. And initial meetings in 1846 between Pueblos and Anglo-Americans from the military were generally positive, and representatives from the U.S. gained a favorable impression of the Pueblos. Just as Spain had believed that Pueblo Indians were ripe for Catholicism and progress and citizenship in Spain, Americans also believed that they were peaceful, tractable, even somewhat civilized people. Tellingly, U.S. Army officers were met by Pueblo governors who bore silver-tipped canes, varas de justicia, and they were acting as elected officials of sovereign indigenous communities there to establish diplomatic relations with the newest colonial power to enter into the region. Since the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo stipulated that citizens of the Republic of Mexico could become U.S. citizens, and the Pueblos had been Mexican citizens by law, then the question quickly arose as to their political status within the United States. Some argued that Pueblo Indians were citizens of the U.S. by virtue of that treaty, and different groups quickly attempted to make the Pueblos pawns in their own power grabs. The reason being that the Pueblos represented thousands of potential voters that could swing municipal and territorial elections. In an 1850 referendum to decide whether New Mexico would enter the United States as a state or a territory, both sides, both for and against, for statehood or for territorial status, heavily solicited Pueblo Indian votes, even using threats to gain Pueblo support, and a handful of Pueblo voters did turn out. But Congress decided to admit New Mexico as a territory and not as a state. These contentious arguments swirling around Pueblo voting stoked anxieties on the part of Pueblo communities. Many of you might view voting as an essential, even sacred right, and one which you dutifully and enthusiastically exercise on a regular basis. But the Pueblos saw voting from these experiences and U.S. citizenship as an existential threat, beginning in the late 1840s and 1850s. And I'll explain why. Under Spain and Mexico, the Pueblos had enjoyed, again, those certain legal protections of legal status. They lived on lands that had been, quote, granted to them by the Spanish crown. They held these annual elections. Non-Indians were not supposed to live on Pueblo lands. And they had official channels for redress with the Spanish crown. And this persisted through the Mexican period. Again, that's not to say that there weren't abuses, but they retained a fairly high degree of sovereignty and self-determination under difficult circumstances. And there were similar protections offered to Native peoples under U.S. law through the Trade and Intercourse Acts, that Indian lands could not be bought or sold, that non-Indians shouldn't live on those lands. But many in New Mexico argued that Pueblo Indians were too advanced to be classed as Indians. under U.S. law. Ultimately, if the Pueblos were to vote in U.S. elections and become part of the political mainstream, then they would not be able to protect their sovereignty, their way of life, their lands. Just as a practical example, both Anglo-Americans and Hispanos, Nuevo Mexicanos, during the territorial period would go to Pueblo communities and find any Indian they could and then try to entice them to sign over some sort of bill of sale and consider that land theirs. Or they would simply move on to Pueblo lands and say, I'm not going anywhere, I'm staying here. When a handful of Pueblo voters would turn up at an election from time to time, which did happen infrequently, those squatters or interlopers who had taken Pueblo land would argue, see, they're citizens just like us, they voted in elections, they should be able to sell their land freely. And they would use whatever means they could, including threats, bribery, or outright lies to take away Pueblo lands. In order to counter this, the Pueblos began articulating a stance about voting and citizenship. They would forego the vote and subject themselves to the Bureau of Indian Affairs instead, in sort of a ward status, in favor of wardship, whereby the federal government would ostensibly oversee their affairs, but they would retain a degree of community sovereignty and autonomy. In 1851, representatives of 12 of the 19 Pueblos drafted a petition which was sent to Washington, D.C., the governor of Sandia Pueblo acting as voice for this group, and the delegate's message was clear. Quote, none of the Pueblos at this time desire to abandon their old customs and usages in favor of U.S. citizenship. Pueblo sovereignty received a boost during the Civil War era when Dr. Michael Steck, who was a physician and superintendent of Indian Affairs in New Mexico, traveled to the east in 1863, and he had received a steady stream of Pueblo delegations asking him for protection under federal law regulating Indian relations. Again, like I said, the Pueblos had received canes from Spain and from Mexico, and he had canes struck from the President of the United States, silver-tipped canes, in that same tradition. You can see they had an inscription on them for each of the 19 Pueblos, A. Lincoln, Pres, United States, to, in this case, Zia Pueblo, and the date 1863. And this would be considered by the Pueblos as a confirmation of their status as sovereign, or at least semi-sovereign, indigenous communities. Moving forward, the struggle continued, and Pueblo peoples attempted to protect their land and their sovereignty, their right to exist within the American system for a number of decades. And it came to a head in the early 1900s when the Territory of New Mexico declared all of the Pueblos delinquent on property taxes. It said, you're living on your lands, you should have paid property taxes on those Pueblo lands for all of these decades, and took them to court. The New Mexico Supreme Court ruled in New Mexico v. Delinquent Taxpayer in 1904 that Pueblo lands could be alienated and were subject to taxation. The Pueblos were responsible for large sums in unpaid property taxes. But Congress interceded and in 1905 took direct action to exclude the Pueblos from property taxes. And by this time, the Pueblos were clearly exhausted from all of this struggle against the efforts to take power away from them, take their land away from them, politically incorporate them, which was really an effort to get them to disappear. And in 1904, in their clearest articulation of their desires to resist enfranchisement and citizenship, they sent a petition. And the petition read, it was decided in our council that all of the Pueblos that were there represented were opposed to participating as citizens in the public affairs of the territory, and that we want to protest against the taxation of our lands. And it concludes with this very firm statement. We ask all the Pueblos of the territory to join together and consider these matters and take some action to make known to officials in Washington and in this territory and to Congress that is now in session that we do not want to be citizens and that we protest against the taxation of our lands, close quote. As they had expressed on many occasions, and other indigenous communities as well, citizenship and enfranchisement within an American system didn't offer protections, it didn't offer rights, it actually attacked sovereignty and community autonomy. And so they resisted this. Tying this back into today and efforts to rock the native vote which I do think are important, and many, if people, Native people who feel that that's an important avenue, I think that they should take that. But it's also important to recognize that a refusal to engage in that form of electoral politics and political mainstream is also a valid political activity, and that Native people historically have articulated different visions. Visions of sovereignty, of autonomy for those communities that don't revolve around rights within a colonial nation state. I'll conclude there. Thank you.
We do have time for Q&A. I know some students may need to leave to get to another class. Go ahead and sneak out quietly while we get into some Q&A with Dr. Crandall.
Thank you for coming, all of you who did. Do we have any questions? I suppose I can moderate that. If not, we can all just go to an early lunch and then it's hungry. All right, I'll go here first. Yeah.
How do you think, how do you think that some Native people that want to vote are currently being kept from voting?
What means are being employed? Yeah. Oh, there's a lot of ways. I mean, gerrymandering, obviously. Establishing polling stations off reservation as well that require hours of travel. Election materials not being bilingual, so that, like Navajo Nation, for example, where you have monolingual individuals who largely speak Dene language, not having accessible materials. Requirements in places like the Dakotas recently, where you had to have a legal street address, and a lot of Native reservation communities, you don't have a legal street address. You go to the post office, and there aren't even any street, like you wouldn't say what street you live on. You just be like, I live down by my uncle, turn right at that trailer, and I'm down that, but a variety of means. Some of them legal, some of them not necessarily written into law, but just ways to make it more difficult for Native people to vote, and a variety of those means have been incorporated and used, and so that's why you see these efforts to rock the vote, to get polling stations closer to Native communities, to make it so it's not so difficult to travel, so it's not such a burden, to make registration easier, voting by mail, which a lot of people oppose, which I say. Voting by mail makes the electorate larger, but you have these claims, it results in voter fraud, which the evidence doesn't really show. But a lot of those methods have been used with Native people and continue to be used. Yeah.
Was there any difference in Native involvement in the local and state elections versus federal elections, or did it matter?
In which period, I guess, we need to...
Either one.
So recently you had a larger Native American voter turnout in the national election. It really depends on the community. A lot of Native communities sit, they border non-Native communities, and so municipal elections can be really important, can be really contested. In Camp Verde, which you're familiar with, one of our tribal members was on the school board recently, so was elected to the school board, which makes really important decisions. In a small community where there's only, Camp Verde High School and Camp Verde Middle School and one or two elementary schools, I mean, school board officials hold a lot of power. And so in that case, you saw a Native person elected to a school board, which is really important on the local municipal level. Various places, Native people are elected to office to sit on, like county commissions or local or state offices. Larry Echohawk was the Attorney General of Idaho before becoming the Secretary of Undersecretary for Indian Affairs in the BIA. So it does happen, but I think that on the whole, Native American representation in office holding is low. It's very low. It's just low. In places where there are larger populations of Native people, I think you see it more relative to just the general population. But on the whole, I think there's a reason you see these efforts year after year to turn out the Native vote, But there's a reason that Native people don't want to turn out to vote, which is what I'm getting at, right? It hasn't historically helped Native communities to turn out to vote. It's sort of a catch-22. Yeah.
Thank you for this talk. I loved your book. It was
Thank you.
really interesting. I wondered if you could bring it a little bit closer up to the present.
Right.
I was really struck by the discussion in the book of the balancing act between local sovereignty and voting in the nation. And I wondered if any recent decisions, such as the recent Supreme Court decision over
McGirt.
Yeah, McGirt, have made any changes that might alter that balance?
Potentially, yeah. I mean, there's the Cherokee Nation through treaty have a congressional delegate, or are supposed to have had a congressional delegate, which they'd never sent for decades, and then recently started bringing up that conversation again. So, but then the question is that sort of just a token move, having one non-voting congressional delegate? Like, what good does that do, right? McGirt, I think we're gonna have to wait to see how that plays out, because I think it's gonna be monumental, because basically what it says is the reservations, the Indian land in Indian territory in Oklahoma were never eliminated. So that could have huge ramifications, which I think, let's wait a year or two and see how that plays out. The Violence Against Women Act has also been an important point of discussion, because it allows for certain cases, tribal judiciaries and say like tribal governments to punish non-Indians for offenses committed on reservations, which through Oliphant you couldn't do for a number of decades. So that could be important as it develops. I actually would turn our attention farther south to Mexico. With what happened in September, the president of Mexico, López Obrador, went to the Yaqui communities and apologized for the genocide perpetrated against Yaquis, and committed to Yaqui autonomy and sovereignty, also helping them gain land back and water rights, massive infusions of money for education, for healthcare. That seems like something substantial. We'll see. That's only been a couple months that declaration was made, but there was a document signed by the Yaqui governors in those communities, who have maintained a lot of sovereignty, despite very harsh efforts by the Mexican government to eliminate them, at genocide. So I think that you see efforts during the pandemic. You saw indigenous communities closing roads that traveled through that were state roads or thoroughfares, and saying, no, we don't want outside travelers. We don't care about rights of way or eminent domain or anything like that. Our communities need to be protected. These are our boundaries. These are our territorial bounds, and we won't let outsiders go. Some of the Lakota peoples in the Northern Plains region closed off their reservations to outsiders. Our reservation shut down to non-tribal members as well. But in those cases, there were state roads going through, and to close those roads and block them, that's a pretty significant show of sovereignty. I think those are examples that come to mind, but it's always going to be a balancing act. I think that you're right. Indigenous nationalists would say we need to stop looking to a colonial state, a settler state, as the avenue for securing our rights or our sovereignty. That's never going to happen there. We need to be sovereign. We need to act sovereign. We need to do the things that sovereign nations do. And you see those types of actions happening. And I think that we'll see more of that. And I hope that we do. We should be sovereign nations. We are sovereign nations. We are communities. We're still intact. We still have our people and our land. And I hope that we transition to be more sovereign and with an eye to eventual liberation. Yeah.
Yeah, can you maybe compare this to electoral participation from other indigenous folks, say like the Iroquois in the Northeast, who also have a very long history dealing with several colonial ventures, or even the so-called civilized tribes of the Southeast, Choctaw, Cherokee, etc.
Right. Sure. I mean, it's bringing up Haudenosaunee peoples, I think, is a great example. issues of sovereignty, of citizenship, of those people who straddle the U.S.-Canada border, Mohawk communities at places like Ganawage and Akwesasne. Those are places where these debates are ongoing. And a lot of these people say, we're not U.S. citizens, or we're not Canadian citizens. We are Mohawk people, or we are people of the Longhouse. And the Jay Treaty, for example, secures safe passage. It should be unobstructed passage of people across that boundary, back and forth, and the passage of goods and materials. And this always, becomes a hot point of contention with nation-state governments, Canada and the United States, that want to regulate people crossing those borders, goods going across those borders. But there was and has been for a long time fierce opposition to efforts by both Canada and the United States to politically incorporate those people. Because we need to think about what political incorporation means. When we're talking about the 19th century, the 20th century, policies aimed at political incorporation of Native peoples mean the disappearance of Native peoples, right? The melting pot idea, we want them to melt into that pot and go away. We want them to not be Indians anymore. We want them to just disappear, essentially. And you do that through erasing culture, through erasing language, through trying to break ties to land and history. So things like allotment, enfranchisement, citizenship, which we would view as maybe like a common good, right? Isn't that a good thing? When they're aimed at destroying a people, then they're not good. That's essentially the argument that I'm making. And you see that resistance in a lot of these communities. Haudenosaunee peoples, I could go on about this. You asked about southeastern peoples, the so-called civilized tribes, their efforts. They tried to pursue a different way. Some of them became slaveholding, sort of plantation economies. That's a different approach, sort of trying to be like the American mainstream, but also still maintaining a distinct political independent existence in the Southeast, which ultimately didn't work. And in the era of removal, they're all moved to Oklahoma, to Indian Territory. But I could talk more, but it's just in a matter of time. I think, how much time do we have left? Any other questions? Maybe a final question if anyone has one. No? All right. Thank you all again for coming. Really appreciate it.